Good YouTube, it's your boy Blue Blood Sports TV back at y'all with another one. So, undefeated, unified WBC, IBF, welterweight world champion, superstar boxer, who is widely considered by many to be top 3 pound-for-pound fighters in the world, in Errol the True Spence Jr. Well, Errol Spence Jr., he responds to former 4-division world champion, former legendary, iconic, Hall of Fame superstar boxer, Roy Jones Jr. Now, we know Roy Jones Jr., he favors undefeated 3-division world champion, former junior welterweight undisputed world champion, currently the WBO welterweight world champion, who is widely considered by many to be the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world, in Terrence Bud Crawford. Now, Terrence Crawford is also favored by Roy Jones as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. He sees Terrence Crawford as the best fighter in the world. And so with that, Roy Jones, he favors Terrence Crawford. And Roy Jones, he looks at the situation between Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence, which is the super fight in the sport of boxing. Errol Spence versus Terrence Crawford is the super fight in the sport of boxing. Very rarely do you have guys in their absolute prime, both undefeated, both world champions, multi-time world champions, both in the prime of their career, both young, and they're in the same weight division and can fight. It's very rare. Now, you have guys that are legends in a weight class above or weight class below. You know, Roberto Duran, he came up from 135, jumped up to 147, challenged Sugar Ray Leonard, jumped 2 weight class jump. You know, Shane Mosley did so against Oscar De La Hoya. You know, you have guys in other weight classes that are legends, but very rarely do you have guys in one weight class that are absolutely in their prime and can fight, like Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence. Now, there was, in Roy's case, that was the case in Roy Jones' case, right? When he had Bernard Hopkins and James Toney in and around his weight class, right? And he fought those guys very early in his career. You know, most would say that Bernard Hopkins wasn't in his prime, okay? Bernard Hopkins, he grew. You know, he garnered experience. He grew later on in his career. He didn't, you know, when Roy Jones beat him, yeah, he was seen as one of the best fighters in the division, but he wasn't the Bernard Hopkins, you know, that we come to love. You know what I mean? Now, James Toney, on the other hand, he was a blue chip prospect. James Toney was already making a name. He was already a big name. So, you know, people thought that James Toney was going to beat Roy Jones, right? But this case is is slightly different, right? So, with that said, when discussing it, it's very abundantly clear that Roy Jones Jr. Favors Terrence Crawford. You know, whatever it is about Terrence Crawford, maybe it's their relationship, you know, maybe it's just that he identifies with Terrence Crawford's style and personality, you know what I mean? He don't identify with that of Errol Spence's. So he says that Errol Spence hasn't fought anybody. He needs to fight better opposition. He says Terrence Crawford is #1 on his pound-for-pound list because he's fighting everybody, and Errol Spence is not fighting everybody. Well, we know that not to be true, okay? Because all you have to do is measure the 2 resumes, and you can clearly see that Errol Spence has been fighting a better opposition. So with that said, Roy Jones said that Errol Spence can't make his pound-for-pound list. He gave him stipulation, right? He said if he beat 2-time welterweight world champion superstar boxer Showtime Sean Porter, then he would put him on the pound-for-pound list, okay? He would move him up. Well, he beat Sean Porter, and now Roy Jones is still saying Errol Spence needs to fight better opposition. But he has Terrence Crawford at #1. The biggest name on Terrence Crawford's resume is Kell Brook. He didn't give Errol Spence credit for fighting Kell Brook and beating Kell Brook because he said he had a broken orbital bone. That was 9 months prior when Kell Brook dared to be great, moved up from welterweight 147 and jumped up to 160 to challenge Gennady Triple G Golovkin, who at the time was the undefeated, unified, reigning middleweight world champion. So, you know, Kell Brook dared to be great. Gennady Golovkin needed an opponent. He went up, tried to attempt to beat Gennady Golovkin, create history for himself and his legacy, and he came up short. Gennady Golovkin ended up breaking his orbital bone. So with that said, you know, 9 months later, he had to fight Errol Spence Jr. because Errol Spence Jr. was his mandatory challenger. Okay, so he went up 9 months. He went 9 months later, came back down to 147, and he challenged. And well, Errol Spence challenged him in his backyard for his IBF title. Okay, Errol Spence broke his other orbital bone, and you know, was victorious in the fight. But that was Errol Spence's first opportunity at a world title. Okay, but he gives Terence Crawford credit for beating the same Kell Brook that was 3.5 years later after Errol Spence did it, and he did the same thing. He came back down from 54 to challenge Terence Crawford at 147, just like he came down from, you know, 160 to challenge Errol to face off against Errol Spence, because Errol Spence was the challenger, Terence Crawford was the champion. Okay, so Kell Brook was challenging Terence Crawford, Errol Spence was challenging Kell Brook. So with that said, Errol Spence said, you know, what Roy Jones has to say, he takes with a grain of salt, because he don't need Roy Jones, who is a legend, to validate, you know, what he's doing in his career, his legacy, and what he's going to be doing moving forward. And, you know, Errol Spence has said this before. He said, you know, it's a shame that the greats of yesteryear, you know, don't embrace, you know, the fighters of today's time. And this is a clear indication. Now, hey, to each his own, right? His preference of fighters is his preference of fighters. But Roy Jones, to say that Errol Spence, who's fought 3 guys who are, you know, at the very least, you know, these 3 guys, Mikey Garcia, which he don't give Errol Spence credit for beating Mikey Garcia. He says that Mikey Garcia was a little guy and he should have beaten Mikey Garcia. But he gives Terence Crawford credit for beating Yuriorkis Gamboa. How ironic, right? Mikey Garcia and Yuriorkis Gamboa, they came from the same weight class. And ironically, Mikey Garcia and Yuriorkis Gamboa was seen as a big fight at 126. That was seen as a super fight at 126. So they came in, they were in the same weight class at one point in time. So this is the guy that came up and challenged Terence Crawford for Terence Crawford belt, and he hurt Terence Crawford a few times in that fight, Yuriorkis Gamboa. Now, so when you don't give Errol Spence credit for beating Mikey Garcia, but you give Terence Crawford credit for beating Yuriorkis Gamboa, well, that's an oxymoron, because they was in the same weight class and they were seen as the mega fight that never came to fruition due to Mikey Garcia having issues with, you know, the promotional company with Top Rank and Bob Arum. You understand what I'm saying? So that fight never came to fruition, but they was in the same weight class, okay? And so then, you know, he says that, you know, Terence Crawford is fighting all the best opposition. You know, you understand? It's one thing to say that Terence Crawford, you know, you fancy his skill set over Errol Spence's skill set. And you say, well, you know what? I favor Terence Crawford's skill set over Errol Spence's skill set. But Errol Spence beat 4-division world champion, Mexican superstar boxer, who's a surefire Hall of Famer in Mikey Garcia, right? And he outclassed him. Terence Crawford had a rough, rugged fight with Yuriorkis Gamboa. Now, he stopped Yuriorkis Gamboa. He got the victory, but it was a tough fight where he was hurt in the fight a few times, okay? So with that said, you know, you got to give him credit as well. You understand what I'm saying? You have to give both guys credit. If you're going to give one credit for beating one guy, you got to give both, because Mikey Garcia was seen as the better fighter between Yuriorkis Gamboa and himself. So he was seen as the better opposition, right? He was the favorite going into a fight with Yuriorkis Gamboa, Mikey Garcia. So if you're going to give Terence Crawford credit for beating Gamboa, then you have to give Errol Spence credit for beating Mikey Garcia. And then you look at the fight between himself and Sean Porter. Now, this is the fight that you said needed to take place for you to stamp Errol Spence as a pound-for-pound fighter. This was a Fight of the Year candidate, right? Or Fight of the Year. You know, it was a nip and tuck fight. Errol Spence dropped Sean Porter in the 11th round. The championship rounds. Errol Spence wins the championship round. He dropped Sean Porter in the 11th round and clearly wins the 12th round, right? What more separation do you need, okay? And you can't say, well, he was in a rough fight with Sean Porter. Well, everybody's in a rough fight with Sean Porter. Nobody goes in the ring and blows Sean Porter out the water. Not a single fighter. Sean Porter, all his losses were very, very close losses, to where there's people that say, well, I thought Sean Porter won the fight. Well, I thought this person won the fight. Okay. So nobody has blown Sean Porter out the water. So Errol Spence's fight with Sean Porter is no exception. Sean Porter's a great fighter. That's why you said you needed to see Sean Porter and Mike and Errol Spence Jr. So, you know, then you still don't give him credit for beating Sean Porter. You know, so Errol Spence, he says, you know what? It's a shame that the fighters from yesteryear, from the past, don't support us fighters today's time, uplift us, and you know, help us through our journey. And it truly is. You know, so it's abundantly clear Roy Jones just fancies the style of Sean Porter. I mean, excuse me, of Terrence Crawford. You know, and ironically enough, Roy Jones went through his career, and people stated, all they stated was Roy Jones only fights cab drivers and Uber drivers and retired firemen and retired police officers. Right? This was the perception of Roy Jones in his career, was that Roy Jones only fought cab drivers, bus drivers, retired firefighters, and retired police officers. That was the perception of Roy Jones throughout his career, outside of the fight with Bernard Hopkins and outside of the fight with James Toney. Okay, so, and he had the first fight with Montel Griffin, the second fight. Okay, so, you know, it's ironic that Roy Jones would say this. So that's Errol Spence's response. He says it's a shame, but you know what? He takes what Roy Jones says with a grain of salt, because he never needed him to validate his career. But that's all I got for y'all, man. Make sure you hit the like button. Drop a comment in the comment section. Let me know what y'all think. Y'all already know what it is. It's your boy Blue, Blue Blood Sports TV. Hate, like, comment, and subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button. Hit the bell icon to get all the new notification. Follow me on Instagram at Blue Blood Sports TV, all one word. Y'all already know what it is. Shout out to the entire LDBC. Shout out to New Media. Shout out to Black Media Row. Make sure you like and share these videos. That's all I got for y'all. Peace.